This talk is Symfony Console, build awesome command line scripts with ease. I'm Oscar. If you're here for the other summit, that's in room D. But you can't leave now that I've started. If you want to follow along, there's a lot of code. I've already posted the slides. There's a PDF. You can go to phpa.me/oam-symphony console. And it might be easier to read some of the code. Cool. In this talk, I'll show you how you can create a command line application like Composer or Drupal Compose to make your life easier. So you'll see how to add commands, how to get input from users and display feedback, and how to package it up as a standalone file to distribute to others. I should say, we're going to look at a lot of code, if you have any questions, there's plenty of time at the end, but if something's unclear, just let me know, raise your hand, and I'll try to explain it better before we advance. Okay. So why would you want to automate tasks? The easy answer is to prevent errors on routine tasks and speed them up too. If you do something frequently, or if a task has a lot of steps that are prone to mistakes, then you should definitely automate it. A good developer is lazy, right? So by doing this, you can free your time up to do more valuable things instead of the routine boring stuff. Before you automate all the things, check if it's worth sinking a lot of time into it. So it makes sense to spend time automating the things you do very frequently and take long to do. If a task is particularly error prone, you should automate that too. As usual, there's an XKCD comment for every situation. There's this one that plots how long a task takes and how often you do it, and it gives you a rough idea of how much time you should spend automating it. So it's a good handy reference to do it. If you're not going to be at a job for very long, some of these time periods may not make sense, but as an organization, you should be promoting and encouraging people to automate stuff for you. Are you looking for the summit?
Yes.
It's in room D. Okay, what kind of tasks can you automate? With the right packages, almost anything. So these are some examples of tasks that I've automated myself to save time during the day. You can generate a new set of tickets in an issue tracker when a project kicks off. You can prepare status reports afterwards to show like a client or a manager what you've been working on for a month. You can prepare a MailChimp template for a campaign, generate images to share on social media from some pre-canned templates, combine a bunch of CSV files into a single Excel spreadsheet or tabs within an Excel spreadsheet for further analysis. Basically, a command line script has all the facilities of PHP at its disposal. So you can talk to APIs, databases, the file system, anything's possible with a little search and finding the right packages. All right, so we've looked at the why. Here are the nuts and bolts of what you'll be doing. We're going to be using Symfony Console component. It eases the creation of beautiful and testable command line interfaces. It's very lightweight. It doesn't have a lot of dependencies. It's part of the Symfony project, so it's well-written code, it's unit tested, it's well architected. Almost any behavior, and we're only going to look at the most common ones, but you can extend it pretty easily to add your own features if you need to. And it's on GitHub at Symfony/console if you ever want to look at the code or look at the issue tracker, file a bug. That's a good place to start. How should you set up your directories? This is a structure I typically use. So I have two subdirectories, one for the actual app and a build directory, which will make sense a little later. And within the app directories where all your code goes. Resources holds any templates that your commands might use, like if there's a HTML template or images you're going to reuse, those sorts of resources. The source directory has all your classes. That's where your commands and anything else that supports your app will live. Vendor is where Composer will pull in any of your dependencies. If you're using third-party packages, you can use Composer just like you do with Drupal to bring new packages in and use them. Okay. To install it, it's easily installed via Composer. So you just issue this command, composer requires Symfony/console. If there isn't a composer.json file, it'll create one for you. And it'll just do the typical composer thing. It'll run for like 30 seconds to a minute, put everything in vendor. There's only like 4 or 5 packages that can be pulled in that the console component itself depends on. So it's very lightweight. The next thing you should do is register our source directory with Composer's Autoloader. We do that by creating a namespace and a directory for our command line application under that source directory. So in this case, the example app I have is going to use the govcon namespace, which you see there under that PSR4 key, and it's going to map to a directory called govcon under the source folder. This makes sense for everyone? It's very similar to how Drupal 8 modules use the PSR4 autoloader. So if you've built your own modules or peeked into that, this is very analogous to that. Just remember to run composer dump autoload after you do this, so that Composer rebuilds this autoload PHP file to know to look in this path for you. Any questions so far? Okay. First step in creating our app, we're going to create a file called app/govcon.php, and it's very basic. We require our Composer autoloader. We'll pull in Symfony component console application. That's the core object that drives the whole thing. And then we're going to instantiate it and run it. Any questions so far? That's all you need to do to get a command ready to run it in your terminal. But it doesn't do much at this point. Do you have a question? You look, no? Okay. If you run it now, you'll see some boilerplate functionality already provided out of the box. So it'll give you, the console component gives you a nice usage showing how to run it. And at the bottom, it'll list, let's see if does this work. Let me scroll this. And at the bottom, it lists all the commands that you've registered. We haven't done that yet. But does anyone work with Drupal console or Artisan from Laravel? This should look pretty familiar, all the switches and output. Let's add a command to show the current time to our users. We'll do that by creating a file called whattime.php in our source folder, and we'll tell it to live in the govcon namespace. That's what the first line does. That namespace, along with the class name, enables the autoloader to find it when we when we register it later in our main application. We pull in some other objects that we're going to need. The Symfony command, the input interface and output interface lets us take user input in and also display stuff back out to them. And then Art class extends that base command class. To actually do anything, you have to implement a configure method and an execute method. The configure command sets the name to use to execute your command, and as well as any other optional arguments and parameters that you expect the user to enter. At the minimum, you need to set 2. You need to set the name, and that's what someone would type in to run your command. In this case, it's gc:"whattime, and that's a typical way to name your commands is to give it like some descriptive name : and a more specific one, because the first part in front of the colon, the console component will use that to group commands in that big list of things. So if you've got a lot of things related to like a mailing list or working with your issue tracker, pick a good prefix there so that all those commands are grouped together if someone looks at all the commands in your command line app. Then the description will give the user some indication of what your command is going to do. In this case, it's going to display the current time. There's also a set help method, which you can provide way more information. If someone issues your command with --help, they'll see this. You can explain to them in more detail, what your command's going to do, what it needs, that sort of stuff. Okay, the execute method is where we do any of the work needed. In this case, we're doing something pretty simple. We're creating a datetime object, and without any parameters, that's going to have the current time in it. And we're using the write-ln method to display the current time in a human-readable format. In this case, it's hour, time, hour, minute, and then AM or PM. And that's it. That's all it takes to set up a command. That doesn't mean we're done, though. You can check if it was added. You can run the application again without any commands, and you'll see a list of all the registered commands. Our new one pops up under that GC grouping, what time, along with the description, displays the current time that we entered before. Then if you actually were to run it, in this case, php.con.php, that's our app. GC : what time, that's our command. It'll display, it's now 2:56 p.m. That was when I last ran it. It's not accurate, it's not live. So what else can you do to get user input and output? So questions let us get interactive input from the user. The question helper lets us prompt the user for input with a question object. In this case, we have a default name called human. And then we create a question object. We're going to ask them what's your name and show them the default. The second parameter is our default. So if the user doesn't enter anything, the default will be used. And then that just sets up the question. To actually issue it to the terminal and the command in the flow of the execution, you get your helper and you call the ask method and pass it the input, the output objects, as well as your output question, your question object. So whatever, let me see, I thought the laser pointer would work. Whatever the user enters at the prompt, oh shoot. Whatever the user enters at that what is your name prompt will be assigned to the name variable, and we can use that in our write-line method to echo it out. And that's the result of running it. We call it the same way we did before. This time the prompt comes up, what's your name? I put in my name and it says it's now 3:02, Oscar. So this is good for asking, and if, like, I do this with my MailChimp template, when I have to enter the name of the month or the issue, and select what campaign it's part of, that sort of stuff. Or what day of month you want to run a report for. This is pretty handy if you don't want to do it via another method. You can also, shoot, I got disconnected. A note on output, so you saw how to use write-line method. There's also a just a straight up write method. Write-line appends an end of line to whatever string you're showing the user, so it's pretty handy. If you don't want it to do that because you're outputting a series of things that should all flow together, then you can use the write method instead of the output object. You can also real easily colorize your output. So if you use those, they look like HTML tags, info, comment, question, and error, inside of your string, when it gets rendered in the terminal, they'll actually be colored green, yellow, black on cyan, or white on red automatically for you, which makes it easy to, if you want something to stand out, use the error tag. If you're providing progress on an operation, use the info tag. If something kind of went wrong or needs attention, you can use the comment tag. And if you want your own color schemes, this is where, like, you can extend it and create your own if you dig into the formatters that the console command the command component uses. Okay. Another way to get input in is with positional arguments. They can be required or optional. This just means that after your command, the user has to enter some argument, one or more, depending on how you configure it. In this case, we use that to specify a format for the output string, the full date. That's what that FJY does. After it gets the person's name, it'll use that format in the echo in the output. It's now July 31st, 2017, 3:13. So how does that happen? In our configure method, we're going to create an input argument object, and we're going to use an input argument. When we're setting all the different configuration things for our command, we use that add argument method. The first parameter is like the key that we're going to use to retrieve it later. Then there's a constant that specifies whether it's required or optional. And the last bit is a descriptive text. If someone looks at the help for your command, that's what will be displayed as what that format expects. So you can be as verbose and helpful as you need to be in there. So that sets up our command to take in an argument. Inside our execute method, if we wanted to retrieve it, we call the get argument method for our input object, and we pass it the name of that argument that we set. You can have as many arguments as makes sense in your command, just give them, separate keys. And the order that you register them in is the order that the user puts them in on the command line. So once we get it stored in the format variable, and we can use that when we echo the time to change the format. Any questions so far? Okay. Positional arguments are useful. I prefer using switches, and if you like the command line, you're probably very familiar with them. They're another way to get user input. I think they look more readable, especially if you're scrolling through a history of commands and trying to remember how you did something. So it might be easier to specify the format with a -- format script switch. The rest of the script works pretty much the same way. We're just going to take whatever string the user enters there and use it to format the current time. Just like the argument before, we're going to use a different object. In this case, it's the input option object, and we pull that into our class at the very top with that use keyword. And then the autoloader, of course, behind the scenes is bringing in that class automatically from Symfony's console command or class. We use the add option just like we used add argument before. The first is the name that we're going to give the switch, and that's also what the -- is expected to be. So use something alphanumeric. Don't use spaces or any like really weird characters that will work on the command line. You can optionally specify a shortcut. So instead of -- format, if you want someone to enter just -f, you can specify there. If you don't want a shortcut, you can just leave that as null. You can also set with a constant whether that value is optional or required. And then the last one is, as usual, the help message descriptive to indicate what that does. Then in our execute method, it's the same as using a positional argument. In this case, we're going to call the get option method of the input object with the key that we passed it. Since this one's optional, what I use this here is the null coalesce operator. So if the first, the thing to the left of the 2 question marks is empty, it'll default to using our old format, the GIA, for usage. The rest is pretty much the same. Once we have the format variable populated with whatever the user input, we can use it in our write line command. Cool. That's not all. You can also give users a list of things to choose from and have them select from one of them. And this uses the choice object. This is what it looks like. We can ask them a question, which format do you prefer? We give them a list of things. The keys in blue, it does a nice little autocomplete, so you can just start typing MI and it'll fill in the rest. You hit tab. And the Symfony Console takes care of all that kind of interactivity for you nicely. To do this, we don't need to do anything in our configure, because we're just going to ask this in our execute method. First, you set up your choices. In this case, we just have those 2 formats, military and common is what I call them. So the first one shows military time, 0 to 2400 hours or 2300. And then we create a choice question object. I use the question tag so that it stands out a little bit more in the terminal. Which format do you prefer? And I pass it my array. So you don't have to hard code this array. If you can get a list of things from a database, an API or whatever, you can build that list dynamically, which is what I do with my MailChimp tool. Then we get a helper. the question helper, and that object will actually, issue the command to the terminal to display it and retrieve the user input and all that stuff. Once we get that, the only slightly different thing I had to do here is I have the format they chose in the format variable, and that's not going to be the actual format string, it's going to be the key that they picked, so either military or common. So I had to refer that back to the choices array to get the right value out of the hash. All right. So a final way to persist values that you use a lot across commands is to use a configuration file. So API credentials, username and passwords, you can put these in a configuration file somewhere and specify a switch pointing to that file for your command to reuse. So in our configure method, we'll just create an option called config. It's going to be required. So whenever someone runs our command, they would have to do our command --config and specify it. We can get the name of that file by calling get option, and you can even provide a default again if you needed to. Then the next is up to you. You're going to have to read that file and parse it somehow. It can be whatever makes sense to you. You could use a JSON file, YAML. Symfony has a nice YAML interpreter. You could use a simple INI file and use PHP's built-in parse INI stuff. Whatever makes sense for you and your team. This is something that you might edit semi-frequently, so you want it to be kind of human readable and editable. But whatever is easiest for you is really what determines it. There's no hard rule on that. So those are the basics for creating a console app, and you saw a simple one for getting input and output. Now, if you're working with an API or something else, you might be bringing in other objects like clients and setup keys and all the rest. But that's no different than you would do that in web backend or anywhere else. So there's really no magic there to worry about. Who's heard of a phar file before? Okay, a few hands. Who's working with Drupal 8 and Composer? Okay, so you've all worked with it in a phar file in one form or another. It's basically, it was introduced in 5.4, I believe. It's an archive file used to distribute a complete PHP application or library in a single file. They have a definite structure, a little header, and some metadata that describes its contents. And then you can kind of think of it as a zip file for PHP files. Any file you put in the phar file gets kind of archived into that format. There's actually like 3 formats if you ever care to dig into it. There are multiple ways to build one. I'll just show you how I do it. There's also a tutorial on SitePoint on packaging your apps with phar. There's a couple of different ways to do it. I found one that works, so I'm sticking with that. And this is where our build directory comes in handy. As you can see, this is my build phar script. It's not all that complicated. We're going to define where our app source code lives. That's what that base source constant does at the top. Then I give it a name. That's going to be the executable or the archive that's going to be produced. The app is the script that we had already written that is going to be what we need to run to invoke our commands. It does a little housekeeping. If an old phar exists, it's going to delete it to replace it with a new one. And then PHP has a phar extension that should be enabled and on by default. If you get an error on that line with the new phar, then it probably just means that it's been disabled. All that does is set a signature. Each of these has to be signed in one way or another so that your users could tell if it's been altered or not. And then basically, the hard work comes in those last 3 lines. We add everything in our app directory to it. And we used SPL's recursive iterator to just go inside of that file, and any file that's in that directory gets added by that recursive directory iterator. I love the SPL's class names, by the way. They're so much fun to say. Does anyone work with SPL much? It's pretty useful for working with files. once you run your script, you'll have a govcon.phar file, or whatever you named it, in your directory. You can make it executable, and, oh, shoot, there's a little more. What makes it executable? The last thing is you have to create a stub, which is the command to run your app. So that hashbang user bin end PHP finds the PHP executable for the system you're on. You can have an end of line after it, and then the create default stub does some magic to create the command line that invokes your govcon.php file in this case. Once you set that stub, you can run this. It'll churn for a little bit, depending on how complicated it is, and at the end of it all, you'll have a govcon.phar file. You can set the executable bit for it, and then you can execute it just like any other command. You could even change the name. You could get rid of the .phar extension if you wanted to. Otherwise, it works the same way as when we invoked it before. We can call our gc what time command. It'll ask us what format we want, and it'll run. There are some gotchas with phar files. If your app file, like one thing I mentioned before, there's that resources directory where we have other files that we may be pulling in to create images or customize a mailing list from a template file. When the phar file is built and executed, it kind of treats the files in there as virtual file system. It'll resolve the paths to an internal thing that works consistently. What I do is I have a resource dir variable in my main govcon.php file, and any command that needs that path gets it injected as a dependency. So when I create that command, I'll just pass it the path. Behind the scenes, when PHP is running the phar file, it'll turn that into some internal representation that says, look inside the phar file at this path. The other thing I found is the glob command doesn't work inside of a phar file. If you haven't used the glob command, it's a real easy way to list all the files in a directory, so you can do glob some path star.php or whatever.
Really quick, so you're saying that dir is resolved at like phar from file type?
Kinda, yeah. That's a good way to think of it. It might not be when the phar is built, it might be when it's executed, that it's doing something behind the scenes to give it like an internal file system kind of representation. This was the biggest headache I ran into. Well, one of the biggest headaches. Glob command didn't work. So when I first built the command, I used glob, it worked fine. When I went to package up the phar, it failed. It turns out you have to use the directory Grater, and that knows how to work with a phar file system automatically.
Can you reference external scripts or external files like if I want?
Yeah, I do that a lot too. And you path it, like if
Pathing also works.
yeah, the pathing, if it's not within the file, if it's come from outside, it's unchanged, so it would point to your file system. So I use that a lot when I'm parsing CSV files. I think I skipped it. No. Not all third-party libraries may work. The one case I ran into was font files. I was trying to create some images on the fly, and I had some fonts I wanted to bundle up in my phar file. But whatever file system internal representation thing it didn't work with the intervention image library that I was using to create those images. So there might be like some gotchas here or there. In that case, what I probably have to do is move the font files out somewhere, pass that in as a command line switch so that it knows where to find them outside the phar file. You should also think of your commands as controllers. If you've written PHP applications or Drupal 8 modules, you know you want to keep your controllers pretty lean. It's a good practice to put your business logic into more service-oriented containers that don't necessarily know a lot about the framework of your web application, or in this case, your command application. The big benefit here might be like you've automated this on the command line. At some point, you're like, oh, well, why don't we put this on the web because someone else needs to run this. But they're not going to install a command line app. If the actual work is done in a contained services kind of class, you can put that in a module, wrap a controller around it, and just rewire it without having to change the services class. You should also be aware of security. If you need to use API keys or credentials, don't bundle them into your phar file, because then anyone who gets that phar file, it wouldn't be hard to deconstruct it and then get your API keys back out. Put them in the config file. Make sure it's locked down so that only the current user can read it. If you're using a phar file for, or even just a Symfony Console app for a cron job or a batch job that you're running on a server somewhere, make sure whatever file holds your credentials, treat it like you do the default settings.php file. Lock it down so that no one who can mess with it, only the right user can read it. That's it. Automation can save you a lot of time and headache and prevent errors. The Symfony Console command handles a lot of the plumbing. That way you can just focus on your use case, figure out how you're going to get the input, and work on the business task at hand without dealing with, like, how am I going to parse options, how am I going to output stuff to the user and handle errors, all that kind of nitty-gritty. Thanks. Like I said, I'm Oscar Morita. You can follow me at nomarita. I'll go back to the slide with the link to download the PDF of these slides. I publish PHP Architect. If you're not familiar with it, it's a monthly magazine for PHP developers. You can check it out at phparch.com. If you're not on our mailing list and you join, you'll get a coupon to check out a digital issue for free. I also have some print issues you can check out if you're interested. We also have a fall conference in Tysons called PHP World. That's coming up in November, and our early bird ends this week. So if you want to save some money, definitely go check it out. We have a great lineup this year. Any questions?
I'm really curious about the MailChimp use case that you were talking about, and how you have MailChimp working with command line script. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so every month when the magazine comes out, I have to send out, basically it's a very similar template where I plug in the new title of the issue, a download link, some other things. And it was really error prone. The reason I automated it was really error prone. I forget to change one link in the footer, and I'd have to manually test for it. So what this does is there's a little MailChimp API client that I create a new campaign, and it has a template with just old values in it. My command line script has a template with some placeholders that automatically know, like, what month and issue it is, and when I run it, it says, what's the issue title, so I put in the issue title, and some other little bits of data, like what month is it going out, and it goes through that HTML, does a very basic string replace, and then with the API, it updates the template associated with my new MailChimp campaign. So what used to take me, honestly, like 45 minutes to an hour between, like, change it in MailChimp, mail it to myself, check all the links, miss one, fix it, it's just now all automatically handled. I don't have to worry about formatting all the links with the right month and year and that sort of stuff. And the MailChimp API, I used, I think, some client that I found on their site around packages. And I found the right method to use, update template, and I pass it whatever parameter it gives me for the campaign, and it just updates it. I create my campaign, run my command, refresh my web browser, and it's got my new title and all the rest automatically. It's been a time saver. That's one of my biggest ones. The other one that I find really useful, I used to take, like, CSV files from Stripe, PayPal, and our bank, and I had to reconcile them each month for our QuickBooks and our accountant. And it was such a pain to do manually. I had gotten down to a manual step, but it took like an hour to 2 to do. But now I just take the CSV files. There's a great PHP Excel writer class that you can actually write. You're not writing a CSV file, you're writing an Excel class. It'll give you a .xls file. So I can create formulas, I can colorize stuff the way that needed to be, and I can create tabs and all the rest. So this what used to take me like an hour to do manually to merge these CSV files now takes 10 minutes after I download them. So, which means I can focus on making sure the numbers are right and not that the data import part went correct. Sure. There's time for more questions, like 5 minutes. Any other requests? Thanks for coming to my talk. I have another one at 3 if you enjoyed this one on using PHP 7, why you should migrate if you haven't already. Thanks.